Alright, second video, fraction addition and subtraction. So we had talked about this previously in person back in Madison, but just for the sake of consistency, we'll get everything on YouTube. So fraction addition and subtraction, how does it work? Why does it work? So just like before, addition represents combining measurements. To add two things means to combine them. So for example, a half plus a quarter would represent, for example, if I have a half cup of flour, my friend has a quarter cup of flour, a half plus a quarter is a number, and that number represents the combined measurement of those two measurements, how much flour we have in total. And so the goal is to compute a half plus a quarter. We want to find what fraction is a half plus a quarter equal to. We want to know what fraction represents this measurement of a half cup of flour and a quarter cup of flour combined. And so as always, we remember how to add fractions from K through 5, but we don't want to just explain how to add fractions. We want to know, why does fraction addition work and why does it make sense? Because if we can understand that better, we'll be able to explain it to other people better. So the key idea is going to be the last thing we had talked about in the previous video, which is that if you're given two fractions, you can always turn them into equivalent fractions with the same denominator. So I didn't say this exactly in the last video, but we'll retouch this point in future videos. Basically, at the end of the last video I said, well, you can always just multiply one fraction by the denominator of the other fraction, and that's the method for getting two equivalent fractions with the same denominator. But you can also just always turn the two given fractions. You don't have to. What I'm saying is you don't have to use that recipe for changing the denominator. You can change the denominator to any common multiple of the two denominators. So for example, a half and a quarter, the denominators are 2 and 4. Our previous recipe for changing into equivalent fractions with its same denominator would have turned both of these fractions into eighths, because 8 is a common multiple of 4 and 2. But we can also just turn them both into quarters, because 4 is a common multiple of 2 and 4. In fact, 4 is the least common multiple of 2 and 4. So in this example, we want to know, what we're still trying to do is we're trying to add a half and a quarter. And the idea is to change both of them into quarters. That's our method. So 1/2 is the same as 2/4. We get that by multiplying both top and bottom of 1/2 by 2. Multiplying top and bottom by the same number gives you an equivalent fraction. And now they're equivalent fractions with the same denominator. Both have denominator 4. So we turned a half plus a fourth into 2/4 plus 1/4. Now we're adding fractions with a common denominator. And adding fractions with a common denominator is easy. You just add the numerators. And this makes sense, because what's 2/4 plus 1/4? Well, it's 3/4. We can see this from the diagram. 1/4, 1/4, 1/4. 2/4 combined with 1/4 is 3/4. We're combining counts of quarters. So there's kind of two things going on here. We're given two fractions. We want to add them. So we change them into equivalent fractions with the same denominator is the first point. And then the second point is our explanation of why adding fractions with a common denominator makes sense. It makes sense because we're combining counts. 2/4 plus 1/4 is 3/4 because we're just combining counts of a quarter. And these two diagrams over here, this is trying to represent what we're doing mathematically with numbers and symbols visually. We have the half and the quarter, and we want to add them and compute that fraction. And this second diagram represents kind of with these additional black lines, it represents turning the half into 2/4. 1/2 is equal to 2/4. We can kind of see this. This blue 1/2 becomes 2 blue quarters. And now we can see more clearly 1/4 1/2 is the same as 1, 2, 3/4. And so the final conclusion is just 2/4 plus 1/4 is 3/4. 1/2 plus 1/4 is 3/4. So this whole thing was one long explanation of the fact that 1/2 plus 1/4 is 3/4. So pretty neat. I think this diagram helps us see that. Here's kind of the key point underlined. One of the key points underlined. To add fractions with the same denominator, just add the numerator. So I think this makes sense. And in general, to add two fractions, turn them into equivalent fractions with a common denominator, then add the fractions with a common denominator. For example, 1/2 plus 1/3, how do we do that? Well, we change them into equivalent fractions with a common denominator. And so this is using the method from last time. If you're given two fractions, you can always just multiply one by the denominator of the other. So 1/2, for example, we'll multiply top and bottom by the denominator of the other. The denominator of the other fraction is 3 in this case, right? So 1 times 3 is 3. 2 times 3 is 6. So 1/2 is equivalent to 3/6 because we multiply top and bottom by the same number. And 1/3, we multiply top and bottom by 2, we get 2/6. 1/3 is equivalent to 2/6. 1/2 is equivalent to 3/6. And the point of this was we've turned the original two fractions into two fractions with a common denominator, 6. And now 3/6 plus 3/6 plus 2/6 is 5/6. There's an illustration of that in writing. And I think the visual way of seeing it is really great. We want to add the half in blue plus the third in purple. How do we do that? Well, we turn both into sixths. 1/2 is equivalent to 3/6. We saw that numerically, and now we're kind of seeing it with this pizza diagram. And now 1/3 is equal to 2/6. And how many do we have total? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1/2 plus 1/3 is 5/6. Pretty neat. Yeah, so I actually made these graphics myself with some website thingy. I'll send you the link again. It's kind of cool to play with, and I think it's handy. And fraction subtraction, exact same deal. Get a common denominator and then subtract. 5/6 minus 1/3, what is that? Well, you can get a common denominator of 6 because 6 is a common multiple of 6 of the denominator 6 and 3. And now what's 5/6 minus 2/6? It's 3/6, right? Because I have 5/6, I take away 2/6. How many sixths do I have left? 3/6. Kind of hard to say that word. And then we can simplify the fraction by dividing numerator and denominator both by 3. 3/6 reduces to 1/2. Excellent. So this puts us in a good place for our next video.